Hello, everybody. It's me, Fee Timms, White Zulu, and welcome to another chapter from my autobiography of the same name. And I hope you had a good festive season, and we're all back to what is reasonably normal at this time of the year and getting on with our lives. I'm going to give you chapter 19 called The Honeyguide. We were sitting outside in the shade as usual after lunch during that still baking hot, half asleep time of the day between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, when almost every creature on the farm falls silent and even the flies slow down to a drowsy buzz. Our parents were asleep, my father in their bedroom with the curtains firmly drawn against the fierce heat, and my mother on the cool front veranda in a white cane armchair with her feet propped up on a footstool. She resolutely fought against having any afternoon nap, even on the very hottest days. But my father insisted, not concerned for her welfare, but for his own sake. If she did not take a nap, she would disturb him by having Jormela push the heavy, noisy petrol lawnmower over the big kikuyu lawn at the front of the house, or get one of the garden women to start hacking away at the lush undergrowth in the border just beneath his open window. Nothing made my father more grumpy than someone disturbing his afternoon pink gin and lunch snooze. He always pulled the phones out of their sockets in the office and their bedroom, and usually forgot to replace them, leaving the farm out of contact for a day or so until somebody managed to get through on the farm radio. This was equally difficult, as both my parents refused to have the CB radio on louder than a whisper. Can't stand all that squawking, they said. I'm not tired, I've got loads to do in the garden, my mother would protest vehemently. But once she'd sat down with the newspaper, it took mere seconds for her to fall asleep on the front veranda after lunch, the paper sliding to the floor, her reading glasses still perched crookedly on the end of her nose. We were sent out of earshot with Evelina, so there was no chance that we'd disturb anybody either. So on this sizzling hot afternoon, she took Delia and me down to the lower lawn to lie on the grass in the shade of one of the tall plane trees. I was 7 years old and bored and frustrated with being lumped in with my little sister all the time, being over 3 years younger than I. As far as I was concerned, she was just too babyish and whiny to make good company. I had little to do, and so I amused myself by tormenting her at every opportunity. I quite enjoyed playing with the knobbly baubles which lay around the base of the vast tree trunk dropped by the tree in the late summertime, but not enough to keep me out of mischief. I surreptitiously picked them apart and pulled tufts out of the golden hair-like centers. I decided the prickly fluff would make excellent itching powder, and suddenly I leant over and stuffed it down the back of my sister's shirt, making her shriek in outrage and turned into a pummeling fury who pushed me to the ground, where I lay laughing and tried to grab her ankles as she kicked at me with her small bare feet. Evelina, worried that the noise might wake my mother and exasperated by our squabbling, pulled us apart and sat us down on either side of her bulky body. "Aye, shh, listen," she said. "Can you hear that?" She looked up, head tilted to one side, her eyes squinting into the glare. We sat still and gazed up into the harshly brilliant blue sky. "Can you hear that?" she asked again. I could detect a shrill, shrieking call from far above, so high that I couldn't see anything, not even a speck. "What is it?" Nervously. It wasn't a call, I knew. "That's Ngwazi. You must be quiet and sit still now, or we'll come and take you away." The thing screamed again and again, but I couldn't see anything. "Who's Ngwazi?" I was feeling slightly panicky now. My sister was whimpering with fright and had clambered into Evelina's blue uniformed lap and pulled the white pinafore over her head. "How? He's a big black flying creature with a white head, and he swoops down and snatches up naughty children. He flies away with them to his lair high up there in the mountains and feeds them to his young." I sat very still and quiet, digesting this information. I felt I ought to ask for more details of Nkwazi, but Evelina hadn't used the word bird in her description, making this creature sound far more terrifying. I'd seen a picture of a fire-breathing dragon in one of our books, as well as a color plate of Prometheus chained to a rock in another, a wonderful book called Greek Myths and Legends. A big, luridly illustrated page showed the half-man, half-god being punished for stealing fire from the gods and giving it to the humans. He was semi-naked, bound tightly with chains to icy, snow-covered rocks on a tiny vertical ledge on a vertical windswept precipice. There were two gruesome-looking vultures in attendance, one flapping in to land, and the other perched on a rock at Prometheus's head, about to begin pecking out his eyes. I wanted to ask Evelina if Ngwazi was a bird or a dragon, but there is no Zulu word for dragon. It's a northern concept. They don't feature in African folklore. And anyway, I was far too frightened. My fertile imagination had generously amalgamated the two, dragon with vulture, and this was what I pictured Ngwazi to look like. I inched nearer her soft, comforting hip and slipped my hand into the pocket of her pinny. "He won't take you if you sit still now and be good," she reassured me. "He only takes very naughty children." I wriggled down so that I lay on the grass with my head on her leg, still staring into the sky to see if I could catch a glimpse of the terrifying dragon bird. I trusted Evelina implicitly, and I knew that if we were in any danger from the creature, she'd run with us into the house where we'd be safe. As I lay there, I heard another call. This time it came from the thicket of bushes just beyond the lawn. Victor, Victor, the bird called over and over again. I sat up again, startled, eyes wide with alarm. Who's that? I asked Evelina anxiously. Aye, that's just Ngedi, the greater Honeyguide. She laughed. Will he harm us? I asked again. He tried to kill me once. She smoothed her dark blue hem over her wide brown knees with satisfaction. I scrambled to my feet, terrified, ready to run back to the house. But she pulled me gently back into the kikuyu grass. Sit still and I'll tell you. She patted her leg for me to put my head back on her thigh. Delia had fallen fast asleep, sprawled on Evelina's lap, her thumb plugged firmly into her mouth. It was long ago when I was still an indombi, a maiden. I was about 14 years old and very beautiful. I was tall and had a slender waist and firm, budding young breasts. I came to the farm with my mother when I was still a child, and I grew up over there, and she pointed behind us to beyond the clump of massive gum trees, where the round thatched huts with their grey mud walls stood in a cluster. My father was a herd boy for Ngosi, whom the Zulus called my grandfather. My mother cleared fire breaks in the dry season with the other women who live on the farm, and they hoed brambles out during the rest of the year. She tied me on her back with a blanket while she worked, just as I did with you when you were smaller, and when it was very hot, she placed me on that same blanket in the shade to sleep, continued Evelina. Tell me about Ngedi. I was impatient. I knew that Evelina's stories could drift off on another subject with ease, especially when she began reminiscing about her youth. Her once maidenly figure had ripened into the traditional sturdy Zulu wife's build, that of a plump matron with big buttocks, ample thighs, and huge breasts. These features were what a Zulu husband looked for in any woman he wanted to marry. Women of traditional build cost a lot of lobola, but they promised that his future wife would be able to bear him many children, as well as to be able to work hard in the kraal, cutting firewood, fetching water from the valley, carrying the heavy container home on her head, and hoeing the sun-baked dry veld to plant sorghum for his beer. That's Maltabella. My mother said that fat women were lazy, but then to my mother a hummingbird on speed would have been considered slow and lazy. As I said, I was young, too young to marry, but old enough to perform some of the duties around the huts. I was sweeping the ground around our sleeping hut to keep it clear so that snakes wouldn't get too close without being seen. When I heard Ngedi calling to me, he'd found a beehive. We are all fond of honey, so running back into our hut to pick up a basket and a box of matches, I followed the call until I could see him perched on a tree near the river. Now that's just behind me in my background photograph, that river and that bush. where Ngedi lives. Still does. I called back to him, "Victor, Victor," and he bobbed from his branch and flew a little way further and then right into the thick bush on the other side of the river. I followed him, and he led me to that old dead yellowwood tree which had been struck by lightning years ago. There, in the hollow of the tree, wild bees had made a new hive, explained Evelina. She sighed with pleasure at the memory and shifted her ample rump to make herself more comfortable on our rug. I was so pleased, and lighting a wisp of dry grass mixed with a bunch of green leaves to make smoke, I climbed into the tree to collect the honey, while Ngedi sat nearby on a branch, watching. When the bees were drowsy enough, I took all the honeycombs out, and he flew down eagerly to look for his share. But there was so little from the small hive that there would be barely enough for our family. So I took all the honey, leaving him to look in vain. Ngedi flew and landed on a tree in front of me, chattering anxiously. Then he followed me, calling more and more loudly, and finally threatening. But I ignored him and walked back down the path towards home, carrying all the honey in my basket on my head. Evelina shook her head ruefully. As I got near our kraal, a tegwan, a hammerkop, flew over the roof of our huts. This was a very bad sign. It always means there will be a death among one of our people living there. And that night, as I lay awake far into the night, I heard Izinkombando, you know him, the owl with horns, hoot 3 times. Another evil omen. It too means death would be coming to somebody in the kraal. When I finally fell asleep, the honeybird came to me in my dreams. He was angry and sat silently while all sorts of terrible creatures came to look at me in my sleep. Evelina pushed her white toque back off her forehead to reveal her tight black curls and rubbed vigorously at her brown skin where beads of perspiration tickled her temples. She continued her story. The next morning, I rose very early, long before sunrise, aching and exhausted from my bad dreams and so little sleep. And I took my basket and a panga. I wanted to find a hive as soon as I could and give all the honey to Ngedi to appease him and put things right between us. On by the river and on that same tree, I saw him sitting, and he called to me and flew off into the bush. I was so pleased. Now I could give him his honey. I ran after him along the path deep into the bush, still looking up at my guide, when out of the corner of my eye I saw something on the ground. And I jumped back just as a big ubulula, puffadder, struck with the speed of lightning at the very place where my bare foot would have trodden. I ran back down the path as fast as I could, and I swear I could hear Ngedi laughing from his tree. He flew away and farther down towards the river again. chattering now, sounding exactly as if he knew where there was a hive, and, eager to please him, I ran after him, this time looking carefully where I trod. On the river bank he stopped again, at the top of a very big old knobthorn tree overlooking the water. He fluttered and chattered to me, and this time, looking very carefully where I put my feet, I approached the broad tree trunk. As I pulled myself up to the first big branch, I found I was looking into a pair of slitted, glowing, yellow-green eyes. There, lying stretched out along the branch, half covered by foliage, was a full-grown leopard, his head resting on his great big front paws. I tore my eyes away from his, and as slowly as I could, I slid back down the tree trunk, picked up my panga and basket, and ran away, jumping from stone to stone across to the other side of the river. Evelina sighed. That whole day I spent following Ngedi. He called me and fluttered temptingly slowly in front of me. But at each place he stopped, I found something that wasn't honey. Once he took me to a termite mound, and just as I put my hand in, thinking there was a hive, I saw a nest of those fierce little yellow scorpions which can kill a man with their sting. On another tree, a young one this time, there was a bright green slender boomslang, a venomous snake for which there is no antidote, its coils perfectly hidden among the green leaves. Finally, I found the Honeyguide perched on a branch above a dry old tree stump. The middle of what had been the tree trunk was hollow, and warily now I peered cautiously down into the darkness of the hole before I put my hand in. There was a terrible hiss, and Uvuzamanzi, the spitting cobra, reared up from where he was sleeping on his golden coils, his hood extended and his eyes blazing. I jumped back, shielding my eyes with my hands from his venom, and again, before he had time to strike with his fangs, I had to run away to save my life. Evelina shook her head as she remembered the incident. It was as if it was yesterday, the sight of that terrible snake, and she shuddered. I knew I had to find honey that day or I would die. I had broken one of the laws of the bush, and I must somehow make it up to the Honeyguide. By nightfall, I was still empty-handed, and Ngedi was still leading me into danger. I went home in the dusk, leaving him chattering indignantly on the same tree next to the river. Again that night I hardly slept, for the calls of Izigovampandu, the spotted eagle owl, and the goatsucker, Uzvolo. Everybody knows how terrifying the ghostly call of that bird is. In my dreams, a puff adder slithered over me, his forked tongue flickering, and his eyes glinting like black beads in the starlight. A jackal howled incessantly, and all the time Ngedi sat at the back of my dream, mocking me. The next morning I was up early again. I was too afraid to leave the kraal because he would surely kill me today. But I knew the only way to appease him was to find him some honey. So I woke my older sister, Tandi. She was a sweet, good girl and, unlike me, had never done Ngedi any wrong. I gave her my basket and begged her to find a wild beehive, collect some honey, and give it all to him. I cannot do that, she said. You were the one who wronged him. You have to make it right. Please, Tandi, I begged. I was sobbing now. He will kill me for sure. Tell you what I can do, she said. I can go out with Ngedi and find a hive with his help. I can collect the honey, leaving behind some for him and some nice fat bee grubs in a comb. Then I will bring the rest of the honey home to you, and you can take it to him. Evelina sighed again, her head tilted back, and her eyes closed at the memory of her relief all those years ago. I was so grateful. I kissed her hands and hurried off down the path to the river. Hurried her off down the path to the river, where Ngedi sat waiting on that same tree. Tandi did as she said she would, and later that morning she returned to the kraal, and balanced on her head was my basket, oozing full of big, juicy honeycombs. Thanking her, I snatched the basket, ran down to the riverbank, and called for Ngedi. He flew down to a branch of his favourite tree, and I knelt down on the mossy ground and laid the basket of honey at the base of the tree. He flew down and began to eat. I was free again. Evelina stroked my hair. The shadows had crept across the grass, and the sun was sinking below the mountain behind the house. Come, it's nearly time for your baths, she said, stretching and yawning. And after she'd tied my still sleepy sister on her back with the shawl, she took my hand and we walked slowly back up past the lawn tennis court towards the house. That night as I slept, my own dreams were of small brown birds, their beaks filled with honeycombs, snakes with flickering forked tongues, and a leopard with two great big green eyes which shone like twin lamps from the dark bush. There was an eagle too, soaring high over the valley, and screamed as he swooped down to snatch me up. I jerked awake with a start and sat up in my bed, eyes wide with fright, my heart thudding. The thumping subsided as gradually I realized where I was and that it was morning. That's all for this time. I hope you enjoyed it. I did used to love all these bush tales and Zulu folklore stories which Evelina told us, and all the other farm staff used to tell us. I want to thank John Moslane very much for being my sound engineer and helping me create these videos. Without him, I couldn't do this. And I'd also like you to visit my website, www.whitezulubook.com, to see lots of photographs and find out plenty more information. So thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.